Camp Shelby, Mississippi, July 14th, 1943. 107 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. The train doors slid open with a metallic screech that seemed to split the thick Mississippi air. Oberleutnant Friedrich Bauer tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. The floor of the freight car pressed against his cheek, warm wood that smelled of creosote and rust. Through the blur of his failing vision, he watched boots approach. American boots. Polished leather that caught the afternoon sun. He waited for the rifle butt to his ribs, the kick that would force him upright, the shouted command in a language he barely understood. Instead, hands, surprisingly gentle, lifted him by the shoulders. "Easy there, buddy, we got you." Bauer's mouth tried to form words, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. When had he last had water? 2 days ago. 3. Time had become elastic in the boxcar, stretching and compressing in waves that matched his fever. 47 men had boarded at the port in Norfolk, 47 walking skeletons from Rommel's once proud Afrika Korps, their uniforms hanging like shrouds on frames of bone and sinew. Major Robert Harrison stood on the platform, clipboard forgotten in his hand. 16 years in the Army Medical Corps had prepared him for many things: gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, the peculiar horror of gas gangrene. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for this. Before him shuffled what remained of the German master race, and they looked like photographs he'd seen from the concentration camps that intelligence was just beginning to whisper about. Bauer felt himself being carried, his feet dragging uselessly behind. The sun burned his eyes, or perhaps it was the scurvy that had turned his vision into a kaleidoscope of pain. Night had become his enemy. When darkness fell, the world disappeared into a gray fog, punctuated only by vague shadows. Vitamin A deficiency, he knew, with the clinical detachment of his medical training. Nyctalopia, night blindness. 1/3 of his comrades suffered from it. The other 2/3 suffered from everything else. He had weighed 92 kilograms when he'd arrived in North Africa in February of 1942. 92 kilograms of Prussian efficiency, medical school education, and unshakable faith in the Führer's vision. Now he was something less than human. 60 kilograms, 32 pounds lighter than a body should be. His ribs pressed against his skin like prison bars. His gums bled when he breathed. The metallic taste of blood had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. The Americans laid him on a stretcher, clean white canvas. When was the last time he'd seen anything clean? The Afrika Korps had fought in dust that penetrated everything: lungs, eyes, the very pores of skin. They'd eaten dust, drunk dust, breathed dust until it became part of their cellular structure. And when the food supplies dwindled, first to half rations, then quarter rations, then whatever could be scavenged from abandoned Italian positions, the dust had begun to win. Quote 1. An American officer stood over him, pencil poised over a form. Quote 2. The words came out as a croak. He tried to remember the proper military protocol for surrender, the phrases he'd memorized in case of capture, but his mind, like his body, had been hollowed out by hunger. Medical officer? Yes, the American made a note. Then you know what's wrong with you. It wasn't a question. Bauer closed his eyes. Yes, he knew. Scurvy from months without fresh fruits or vegetables. Beriberi from the absence of thiamine. Pellagra from niacin deficiency. The complete nutritional collapse of a body pushed beyond its limits. He diagnosed these conditions in others, his men, the soldiers under his care, but he'd been powerless to treat them. No vitamins, no supplements, no food beyond the wormy bread and rancid oil that arrived irregularly from supply lines stretched thin across the Mediterranean. Kasserine Pass. That's where it had ended. February 19th, 1943. The first major engagement between American and German forces in North Africa, and initially it had gone well. The green American troops had broken before the Panzer assault. Victory had seemed inevitable, just as propaganda minister Goebbels had promised. the Herrenvolk sweeping aside the mongrel democracies. Then the Americans had regrouped. Artillery had rained down with a precision that spoke of industrial might beyond imagination. Bauer had been in a field hospital tent, barely worthy of the name, more of a canvas sheet stretched between two burned-out trucks when the shells began falling. The first explosion had torn through the tent's northern side. The second had buried him under sand and debris. When he'd clawed his way to the surface, his left leg refused to bear weight. A piece of shrapnel, small as a postage stamp, had embedded itself in his thigh. Not life-threatening, not even serious by battlefield standards. Just enough to make walking impossible. The German retreat had been chaotic. Bauer had watched from the back of a supply truck as the Afrika Korps fled westward, leaving behind equipment, wounded, and any pretense of invincibility. They'd become prisoners not through surrender, but through simple arithmetic. The Americans had more men, more ammunition, more of everything. The leg wound had festered during the weeks in the temporary POW camp near the coast. Without antibiotics, without clean water to irrigate the wound, infection had set in. The flesh around the shrapnel had turned colors that Bauer recognized from his pathology textbooks, red to purple to the greenish-black of necrosis. He'd expected to lose the leg, then to lose his life. The Americans had food shortages of their own in those early weeks of the North African campaign. Prisoners were fed, but barely, just enough to keep them alive for interrogation. Now the stretcher lifted. Bauer felt himself being carried across the platform. Through his half-closed eyes, he saw other prisoners being helped from the train. Feldwebel Kurt Miller, whom he recognized from the 21st Panzer Division, was being supported between two American soldiers. Miller's face had the waxy yellow color of advanced malnutrition. His legs, Bauer could see, were swollen to twice their normal size, edema from protein deficiency. The man could barely lift his feet. They passed through gates topped with barbed wire. Bauer waited for the familiar environment of a prison camp, bare ground, minimal shelter, guards with rifles and cruel eyes. Instead, the stretcher-bearers carried him toward a long wooden building painted white. Through open windows, he could see metal bed frames, clean sheets, a nurse in a crisp uniform. The cognitive dissonance made his head spin. Or perhaps that was the dehydration, or the fever. His body had become a symphony of failures, each system breaking down in turn, until he could no longer distinguish one type of suffering from another. Inside, the building smelled of antiseptic, not the overwhelming reek of gangrene and dysentery that had defined the Afrika Korps field hospitals, but the clean, sharp scent of carbolic acid and medicinal alcohol. Bauer was lifted onto a bed, an actual bed with a mattress, not a cot or a blanket on the ground, and a thermometer was placed in his mouth before he could protest. Quote 6. A nurse announced, American, female. Her hands were gentle as she examined the infected wound on his leg. Quote 7. Surgery. The word penetrated Bauer's fever-fogged consciousness. He tried to sit up to explain that he could wait, that there must be American soldiers who needed the surgical facilities more, that prisoners shouldn't receive care before the men who'd captured them. But the nurse pressed him back down with one hand. Don't try to talk. Dr. Patterson will be with you in a few minutes. Minutes, not hours, not days, not never. Bauer's training as a medical officer struggled with this information and found it incomprehensible. In the Wehrmacht, even German soldiers sometimes waited days for surgery. Prisoners died waiting, if they received any care at all. The room blurred. Bauer felt his consciousness slipping away, not into the restless half-sleep of the boxcar, but into something deeper. Real unconsciousness. The kind that came when the body finally, mercifully, decided it was safe to stop fighting. He woke to bright lights, operating theater lights, the kind he'd worked under in medical school in Munich, before the war, before everything. A face loomed over him, middle-aged, with wire-rimmed glasses and tired eyes. I'm Dr. William Patterson, Major, United States Army Medical Corps. You're going in for surgery now. The shrapnel in your leg has caused a serious infection, and we need to remove it immediately. Do you understand? Bauer tried to focus. I am prisoner. You're a patient, Patterson corrected. We'll discuss your prisoner status after we save your leg. Now count backward from 10. A mask covered Bauer's face. The smell of ether. 10, 9, 8. His last conscious thought was a question that would haunt him for months to come. Why were they saving him? The Germans who arrived at American POW camps in the summer of 1943 represented a particular kind of defeat. Not the clean capture of a skirmish or the honorable surrender of a surrounded position, but the slow-motion collapse of men whose bodies had been systematically destroyed by their own supply system, or rather, by the absence of a supply system. The Afrika Korps had been Erwin Rommel's masterpiece, a mechanized force that had pushed the British to the edge of defeat in 1942. But desert warfare consumed resources at a rate that even German industry couldn't sustain. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every can of food had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, through waters patrolled by British submarines and aircraft. By late 1942, half of all supply ships never reached North African ports. By early 1943, that number had climbed to 70%. The soldiers didn't starve all at once. Starvation is a process, not an event. First came the reduction in physical performance. Men who could march 20 miles could now barely manage 10. Then the mental changes, irritability, difficulty concentrating, obsessive thoughts about food. Then the visible alterations, weight loss, muscle wasting, the hollow-eyed look of malnutrition. Then the diseases of deficiency, one by one, like dominoes falling. Scurvy appeared first. Vitamin C deficiency. The gums began to bleed. Old wounds reopened. Teeth loosened in their sockets. Bruises appeared spontaneously across the skin. Men became too weak to fight, then too weak to march, then too weak to stand. British sailors who'd suffered from scurvy in the 18th century had called it 1.13. The Afrika Korps soldiers, surrounded by sand instead of water, found it equally merciless. Then came the night blindness. Vitamin A deficiency. At dusk, men who'd had perfect vision found themselves effectively blind. Night operations became impossible. Sentries couldn't see attackers. Drivers couldn't navigate. The tactical advantage shifted dramatically toward forces with adequate nutrition. The British, supplied through the Suez Canal, ate fresh vegetables from Palestine. The Americans, supplied from an industrial base that seemed limitless, ate food that German soldiers could only dream about. Beriberi followed. Thiamine deficiency. The nervous system began to fail. Some men developed wet beriberi, swelling in the legs, fluid in the lungs, heart failure. Others developed dry beriberi, numbness in the extremities, muscle weakness, paralysis. Both types killed slowly and painfully. Pellagra came last, but hit hardest. Niacin deficiency. The 4 Ds, dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, death. Skin lesions that burned in the sun, intestinal problems that turned eating into agony, mental confusion that made soldiers forget their own names, and finally, inevitably, death. By the time of the Kasserine Pass engagement in February 1943, an estimated 40% of Afrika Korps soldiers showed symptoms of at least one deficiency disease. By the time of the German surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, that number had climbed to 70%. The vaunted German military machine had been defeated not by superior tactics or courage, but by basic human biology. Major Robert Harrison had seen casualties before. Wounded men, dying men, men torn apart by bullets and bombs. But casualties were different from victims. A casualty was a soldier who'd been injured in combat. There was honor in that, a certain terrible dignity. What arrived at Camp Shelby in July 1943 were victims, victims of logistics, victims of supply chain failures, victims of a war that had grown too large for Germany's industrial capacity to sustain. Harrison walked through the camp hospital that first evening, clipboard in hand, making notes that would later form the basis of several medical journal articles. Bed 12, Unteroffizier Hans Weber, age 24, weight 49 kilograms at 175 centimeters height, advanced scurvy, multiple dental caries, suspected cardiac insufficiency. Bed 17, Grenadier Anton Schultz, age 19, weight 51 kilograms at 180 centimeters, pellagra with severe dermatitis, mental confusion, malnutrition-induced anemia. Bed 23, Feldwebel Kurt Miller, age 28, weight 51 kilograms at 178 centimeters, protein deficiency with edema, suspected beriberi, night blindness. The numbers told a story more horrifying than any battlefield report. These men had been systematically destroyed from within. Their bodies had consumed themselves, breaking down muscle tissue for energy, leaching calcium from bones, shutting down non-essential systems one by one in a desperate attempt to survive. Some had lost 30% of their body weight. Some had lost 40%. A few had lost nearly half their mass and somehow remained alive. "It's like treating concentration camp victims," Harrison confided to his assistant that night. He regretted the words immediately. The concentration camps were still rumors, whispers from intelligence officers who couldn't verify the stories. But the comparison was apt. These men looked like they'd been deliberately starved, and in a sense they had been, not by malice, but by mathematics. The German war machine had simply run out of food. Friedrich Bauer woke from surgery to find his leg still attached to his body. This surprised him more than anything that had happened in the past 4 months. The wound had been debrided, the infected tissue removed, the shrapnel extracted. A neat line of stitches ran along his thigh. The flesh around it was pink and healthy-looking, not the angry red of infection or the blackish green of necrosis. Someone had cleaned the wound properly. Someone had used antibiotics. "Penicillin," a nurse explained when she saw him staring at the surgical site. "New wonder drug. Saves a lot of lives." Penicillin. Bauer had read about it in medical journals before the war. Fleming's discovery. A mold that produced a bacteria-killing compound. But production had been limited, experimental. The Wehrmacht certainly didn't have it. Even most German civilian hospitals didn't have it. Yet here, in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi, it was being used to save the life of an enemy soldier. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. According to everything Bauer had been taught for the past 10 years, from Hitler youth meetings to Wehrmacht indoctrination sessions to Goebbels radio broadcasts, Americans were subhuman mongrels. A decadent civilization in terminal decline. Soft, weak, incapable of real sacrifice. They would collapse at the first sign of serious resistance. The war would be over in months. Yet these soft, weak mongrels had better medicine than the master race. They had more food, more supplies, more of everything, and they were using those resources to save their enemies. 3 days after surgery, Bauer received his first full meal. Breakfast arrived on a metal tray, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, milk, orange juice. He stared at it for a full minute before touching anything. The last time he'd seen eggs had been in Tunisia in March before the final collapse. The bacon was crispy and hot, real pork, not the mystery meat that had constituted protein in the Afrika Korps rations. The orange juice was fresh, not reconstituted from powder. The butter was genuine dairy, not the rancid margarine that had spoiled on cargo ships crossing the Mediterranean. His stomach, shrunken from months of near starvation, could barely handle the richness. He managed 3 bites of eggs before nausea forced him to stop. The nurse, seeing his struggle, nodded sympathetically. Quote 17. Therapeutic Nutrition Program. The words seemed to belong to a different universe than the one Bauer had been inhabiting. In the Afrika Korps, nutrition had been whatever you could scrounge. Steal from Italian supply depots, trade cigarettes for scraps from Bedouin traders, eat the pack animals when ammunition became more precious than food. The program started gradually, 6 small meals a day instead of 3 large ones, high-calorie foods balanced with vitamin supplements, liver for vitamin A, citrus fruits for vitamin C, whole grains for B vitamins. The nurses monitored everything: weight, temperature, blood pressure, urine output. They took blood samples weekly to track improvements in nutritional markers. Bauer, watching this unfold with his medical training still intact despite the mental fog of malnutrition, recognized it as state-of-the-art nutritional therapy, better than what German civilians were receiving, better certainly than what German POWs in British or Soviet camps were receiving. Reports had filtered through the Wehrmacht about Soviet camps where captured German soldiers died by the thousands from starvation and disease. Yet here, in this Mississippi camp, enemy prisoners were receiving the kind of care that German military hospitals couldn't provide. By the end of the first week, Bauer had gained 4 pounds. His gums had stopped bleeding. The constant metallic taste in his mouth, the taste of his own blood, had faded. He could eat a full meal without nausea. Small victories, but to a body that had been consuming itself, they felt monumental. By the end of the second week, he'd gained another 6 pounds. His vision had begun to improve, not just the night blindness, but the general blurriness that had plagued him for months. He could read again. The camp hospital had a small library, and he found himself drawn to medical textbooks, comparing what he'd learned in Munich to what the Americans were practicing. The differences were humbling. German medicine had been cutting edge before the war, but the Americans had continued advancing while Germany had been focused on conquest. The night blindness persisted longer. Vitamin A deficiency took time to correct, but the nurses made sure his diet included carrots, sweet potatoes, liver, all the foods rich in retinol and carotene. By week 7, he could navigate the hospital ward after dark without bumping into furniture. By week 8, he could read in dim light. By week 9, his vision had returned to normal. Feldwebel Kurt Miller, in the bed next to Bauer's, experienced a similar transformation. The edema in his legs gradually subsided as protein levels returned to normal. The yellow waxy color faded from his skin. His weight climbed from 51 kilograms to 60 kilograms, then to 65. He began walking without assistance, first with a cane, then without. By the end of 3 months, he looked almost human again. Quote 18. Miller confessed one evening as they sat in the hospital's day room. Why are they doing this? It was the question that haunted all of them. Why invest time, money, and resources in healing enemy soldiers? Prisoners were supposed to be kept alive, yes. The Geneva Conventions required that. But this went far beyond the minimum standards. This was genuine medical care, the kind reserved for valued patients, not despised enemies. Bauer had theories. One was practical. Healthy prisoners could work, and the American economy needed laborers with so many of their own men overseas. Another was propaganda. Well-treated prisoners might be useful for psychological operations, encouraging other German soldiers to surrender. A third was simply procedural. American military doctrine required proper medical care for all personnel, including prisoners, and the Americans were nothing if not procedural. But none of these explanations felt complete. There was something else operating here. Something that didn't fit within the framework of war as Bauer understood it. The Americans seemed to genuinely care whether their prisoners lived or died. The nurses weren't just following orders. They actively worried about their patients. Dr. Patterson made rounds twice a day, checking on progress, adjusting treatment plans, asking how everyone felt. The guards, when Bauer finally encountered them during exercise periods, treated prisoners with a brusque courtesy, rather than the calculated cruelty he'd expected. It was possible, Bauer began to realize, that everything he'd been taught about Americans was wrong. Not just slightly wrong or exaggerated, but fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. The psychological transformation began slowly like physical healing, with small moments of cognitive dissonance that accumulated over time. Guy Matro, a Swiss Red Cross inspector, visited Camp Shelby in late July 1943. His report, filed with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, noted with clinical precision, the medical treatment of German prisoners of war is equal to or exceeds that which American military personnel receive. Hospitals are equipped with modern X-ray machines, surgical facilities including aseptic operating theaters, dental clinics, and comprehensive pharmaceutical supplies. Access to new antibiotic medications, including penicillin, is standard, no deficiencies noted. The report was diplomatic in its language, but the implications were staggering. American prisoners in German camps were receiving minimal care, often dying of untreated wounds and diseases. German prisoners in Soviet camps were dying by the thousands from deliberate neglect. Yet here, in American camps, enemy soldiers were receiving world-class medical treatment. Major Harrison began to notice changes beyond the physical. Prisoners who'd arrived sullen and hostile became cooperative, even friendly. They asked questions about American life, American politics, American culture. Some volunteered to help in the camp hospital, translating medical terminology, calming newly arrived prisoners who didn't speak English. Others offered to teach German language classes to American guards who wanted to learn. The shift was particularly pronounced among the medical personnel. Bauer organized a group of captured German medics to assist American doctors. They weren't performing major procedures that would have violated protocols about prisoner labor, but they helped with routine care, wound dressing changes, patient monitoring. It gave them purpose, Bauer explained to Patterson, made them feel useful again. Quote 21. Patterson asked one evening as they reviewed patient charts together. Quote 22, quote 23. Bauer paused, pen hovering over a notation about a patient's antibiotic dosing. I believed in the cause, in the Führer, in everything we were told. He set the pen down carefully. I was wrong. It was the first time he'd said it aloud. The words felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. To admit error was to admit that the past 10 years of his life, from Hitler Youth through university indoctrination through military service, had been based on lies. That the men who died under his care in North Africa had died for nothing. That the hunger, the suffering, the slow physical destruction of the Afrika Korps had all been in service of a fundamentally false ideology. Patterson nodded slowly. What changed your mind? This. Bauer gestured around the hospital ward. All of this. We were taught that you were animals, Untermensch, subhuman, that Jews and Slavs and Anglo-Saxons were inferior races destined to serve German masters. And then the subhumans saved my life, fed me, treated me with respect, used their best medicines on me even though I was their enemy. He shook his head. Either our propaganda was entirely false, or your propaganda about humanitarianism and equality is so sophisticated that it extends even to how you treat prisoners, and I don't think you're that good at propaganda. Patterson laughed, a short, bitter sound. We're terrible at propaganda. The newsreels make everything look heroic and simple. Reality is messy and complicated. He paused. But you're right about one thing. We do believe in human dignity, even for enemies, maybe especially for enemies. This conversation, or variations of it, happened repeatedly throughout the camp system. American psychological warfare specialists, recognizing an opportunity, began distributing leaflets over German positions that told the truth about POW camp conditions. The leaflets included photographs of prisoners eating full meals, receiving medical care, playing sports during recreation time. German command tried to dismiss them as propaganda, but soldiers who later became prisoners confirmed every claim. One leaflet dropped over German positions in Italy in September 1943 featured a photograph of Oberleutnant Bauer, fully recovered, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "This German officer weighed 132 pounds when captured. 3 months later, he weighs 175 pounds. In American prisoner camps, you will receive food, medical care, and humane treatment. Your war is over, but your life is not." The impact was measurable. Surrender rates increased. German soldiers began actively seeking capture rather than fighting to the last man. By late 1943, American intelligence reported that some Wehrmacht units had standing orders to treat POW leaflets as enemy propaganda and destroy them on sight. a tacit admission that the information was true and therefore dangerous. Feldwebel Miller began helping in the camp hospital full-time, translating for newly arrived prisoners who were too sick or traumatized to communicate effectively. He'd developed a gentle manner with the newcomers, understanding from personal experience the shock of transition from starvation to abundance, from expected cruelty to unexpected kindness. Quote 33. He explained to Bauer one afternoon, quote 34. This was the deeper victory of American policy toward prisoners, not just physical recovery, but psychological restructuring. Men who'd spent years marinating in Nazi ideology found that ideology confronted by lived reality, and reality, stubborn and undeniable, won. By October 1943, 3 months after his arrival at Camp Shelby, Friedrich Bauer weighed 79 kilograms, just 7 kilograms below his pre-war norm. His leg wound had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar. His gums were healthy. His vision was perfect. By every measurable standard, he was a healthy 29-year-old man. But the internal changes ran deeper than physiology. Bauer had begun keeping a journal, writing in a notebook provided by the camp library. The entries traced his evolving understanding. August 3rd. I am gaining weight. This should make me happy, but instead I feel angry. Where was this food 6 months ago? Why did my men have to die of scurvy when treatment was this simple? We were told the Allies had no resources, that they were on the brink of collapse, yet they have enough to feed their prisoners better than we fed ourselves. August 17th. Dr. Patterson asked me today about German military hospitals. I told him about the shortages, no antibiotics, inadequate anesthetics, surgeries performed without proper sterilization because we lacked supplies. He seemed genuinely shocked. He thought we were rationing for the war effort. I had to explain there was no rationing. There simply wasn't enough of anything. The war consumed resources faster than they could be produced. America makes so much that they can waste medicines on prisoners. Germany makes so little that our own soldiers die for lack of basic supplies. September 7th. A new group arrived today from Sicily. They look how I must have looked, walking corpses. One man asked if he was being taken to an extermination camp. He'd heard rumors about what Germans do to prisoners. When I explained he'd receive medical treatment and 3 meals a day, he laughed. He thought I was mocking him. Tomorrow, when he wakes up to breakfast, he'll understand. I wonder how long it will take him to question everything he believed, as I have. September 23rd. I realize today that I have not thought about the Führer in weeks. This shocked me. For 10 years, Hitler was the center of German life. His face on every wall, his voice on every radio, his ideology shaping every thought. Here in this American camp, he is simply absent, not mocked, not condemned, just irrelevant. And I find that I do not miss him. I miss Germany. I miss my family. But I do not miss the regime. When did that change? The transformation wasn't just personal. Throughout the American camp system, similar evolutions were occurring. German prisoners began forming discussion groups to debate what they'd experienced. Some remained loyal to Nazi ideology, insisting that American generosity was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. But many others, like Bauer, found their certainties eroding under the weight of contradiction between propaganda and reality. Major Harrison compiled statistics on the recovery rates and presented them at a medical conference in Washington in November 1943. The numbers were remarkable. Average weight gain in first month, 8 to 10 pounds per prisoner. Average weight gain in second month, 10 to 12 pounds per prisoner. Average total recovery by 3 months, 25 to 30 pounds per prisoner. Recovery rate from scurvy, 98% within 6 weeks of vitamin C supplementation. Recovery rate from night blindness, 95% within 7 to 8 weeks of vitamin A supplementation. Recovery rate from beriberi, 87% within 8 to 10 weeks. Recovery rate from pellagra, 79% within 12 weeks. These men were at death's door, Harrison told the assembled medical officers. Many wouldn't have survived another month. Yet with proper nutrition and basic medical care, almost all recovered completely. The lesson isn't just about treating prisoners. It's about the fundamental importance of adequate nutrition for any military force. The Germans lost the Afrika campaign not because their tactics were wrong or their soldiers were cowardly, but because their logistics couldn't support human biology. You can't fight on an empty stomach, no matter how convinced you are of your racial superiority. The presentation generated significant interest in military medical circles, but its impact extended beyond medicine. Psychological warfare specialists recognized that the transformation of German prisoners represented a powerful propaganda tool, not through exaggeration or deception, but through simple documentation of reality. The United States didn't need to lie about its treatment of prisoners. The truth was more compelling than any fiction. By December 1943, letters from German POWs to family members in Germany, carefully censored but largely accurate, began describing camp conditions. These letters, intercepted by German military censors, caused considerable consternation. How could American propaganda have infiltrated even private correspondence? The answer, of course, was that it wasn't propaganda. It was genuine experience being honestly described. Goebbels, in his role as propaganda minister, faced an impossible dilemma. He could not acknowledge that prisoners were well treated without undermining the narrative of American barbarism. But he could not effectively counter the growing evidence without looking foolish. His solution was to largely ignore the issue, focusing instead on Soviet atrocities, which were real and horrific, while downplaying the Western Front. Christmas 1943 arrived at Camp Shelby with unexpected festivities. The American command, recognizing the psychological value of holiday observance, arranged for special meals and recreational activities. German prisoners were allowed to hold religious services, sing traditional carols, even decorate small Christmas trees in the camp common areas. Friedrich Bauer attended midnight mass in the camp chapel, a simple wooden structure that served Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish services at different times. The service was conducted by a captured German chaplain, with American guards standing respectfully at the back. Bauer found himself thinking about Christmas 1942, spent in a tent in the North African desert, eating a thin soup made from hardtack and whatever scraps could be found. A year ago, he'd believed himself part of a glorious crusade. Now, a year later, he was a prisoner who'd been healed by his enemies and found his entire worldview collapsing. After the service, prisoners gathered in the mess hall for a special Christmas dinner. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pie for dessert. It was better than most Christmas dinners Bauer had eaten in peacetime Germany. The irony was not lost on anyone. Feldwebel Miller, sitting across from Bauer, raised his cup of coffee in a mock toast. "To our American captors who feed us better than our own commanders did." Several prisoners laughed, but the laughter was tinged with bitterness. The comparison cut deep. They'd suffered for months under German supply systems that couldn't sustain them, then recovered in weeks under American care that exceeded their basic needs. The message was clear. The so-called master race couldn't manage basic logistics, while the supposedly inferior Americans had resources to spare. Quote 38, "Someone asked. It was the question they all avoided." The war continued, though now the tide had clearly turned against Germany. The Soviets were pushing west. The Allies had invaded Italy. American bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. Germany would lose. That much was obvious. But what would happen to prisoners when it did? Quote 39, Bauer said. Quote 40, quote 41. No one had an answer to that. The Germany they'd left was already gone, transformed by years of war. The Germany that would emerge from defeat would be something else entirely, something they couldn't yet imagine. Quote 42, Miller said quietly. Quote 43. He trailed off. Everyone knew the Eastern Front was a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions. Survival there was measured in days, not years. The table fell silent. Even in captivity, even with full bellies and warm beds, the shadow of the war's brutality hung over them. They were isolated from it now, safe behind American barbed wire. But they carried it within them. The memories of men dying from hunger, of wounds that festered for lack of antibiotics. of the slow realization that the glorious campaign had become a death march. By January 1944, 6 months after his capture, Bauer had become an unofficial liaison between the German prisoners and American medical staff. His English had improved dramatically through constant practice, and his medical training made him invaluable for explaining complex health issues. Dr. Patterson increasingly relied on him to communicate with prisoners who spoke no English, particularly those who arrived in acute distress. One evening in mid-January, Patterson invited Bauer to his office for coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute that had become standard in Germany. The office was warm, heated by a radiator that hissed softly in the corner. Outside, Mississippi winter rain drummed against the windows. "I wanted to ask you something," Patterson began. "The medical practices you described from German field hospitals, the lack of antibiotics, the inadequate anesthesia, the shortage of basic supplies. Was that standard throughout the Wehrmacht or just in North Africa?" Bauer considered the question carefully. North Africa was worse than other fronts because of supply line difficulties. But even in Europe, resources were strained. By 1942, we were already seeing shortages. Medical supplies went to the Eastern Front first, then to other theaters. What remained was never enough. He paused. "I think your real question is, how could Germany fight a war without adequate medical infrastructure?" Patterson nodded. "Exactly. It seems suicidal." It was suicidal. But we didn't understand that until it was too late. The propaganda told us we were invincible, that willpower could overcome material disadvantages, that German superiority would triumph over Allied numbers and resources. Bauer laughed bitterly. "Turns out biology doesn't care about ideology. A malnourished soldier can't fight, no matter how dedicated to the Führer he is. Yet you won in the beginning. France fell in 6 weeks. Yes, because we fought short campaigns with adequate supplies. Blitzkrieg worked when wars ended quickly. But when campaigns extended, when we tried to conquer the Soviet Union, when we had to maintain supply lines across the Mediterranean, the system broke down. Germany's industrial capacity couldn't sustain long wars of attrition. We needed quick victories, and when we didn't get them, everything collapsed." Patterson leaned back in his chair. "You understand now that Germany can't win." It wasn't a question. Bauer met his gaze steadily. Quote, 54. Quote, 55. Quote, 56. Bauer searched for the word. Quote, 57. The conversation shifted to technical matters, proposed improvements to the nutrition program, a new batch of prisoners arriving from Italy, plans for expanding the dental clinic. But the underlying truth remained. Bauer had moved beyond mere physical recovery into a deeper transformation. He was no longer a German officer temporarily detained by circumstances. He was a man confronting the fundamental collapse of his belief system. The spring of 1944 brought news of Allied advances on multiple fronts. Italy continued its slow, bloody progress northward. The Soviets pushed through Ukraine and Belarus. And on June 6, the long-awaited Second Front opened with the Normandy landings. In Camp Shelby, German prisoners gathered around radios to hear the news. Some maintained defiant optimism. The Atlantic Wall would hold. The panzers would drive the Allies back into the sea. Wonder weapons were coming that would turn the tide. But most recognized reality. The war was lost. It was only a question of how long the dying would continue. Bauer listened to the BBC broadcast with a curious mixture of emotions. Part of him still identified as German, still felt the instinctive loyalty drilled into him since childhood. But another part, the part that had grown during 6 months of American captivity, recognized that German defeat might be the best outcome, not just for the Allies, but for Germany itself. The Nazi regime had led his country into catastrophe. Perhaps destruction was the only path to redemption. Quote 58. Miller observed, finding Bauer alone in the hospital ward late one evening. Quote 59. Quote 60. Bauer admitted. Quote 61. Miller settled into a chair beside Bauer's. We'll be the Germans who saw both sides, who knew the propaganda was false because we experienced the reality. That's valuable, maybe essential. or will be seen as traitors, prisoners who were brainwashed by the enemy? Perhaps. Miller shrugged. But I'd rather be a live traitor than a dead believer. I've seen what absolute faith costs. It costs everything. The conversation touched on something that had been building among the prisoners, a sense of obligation to bear witness. They'd experienced the failure of Nazi ideology in the most intimate way possible, through their own suffering and subsequent rescue by supposed enemies. That experience had to mean something, had to serve some purpose beyond their individual survival. Some prisoners began writing detailed accounts of their experiences, documenting the conditions in North Africa, the diseases of malnutrition, the contrast between German propaganda and American reality. These accounts were carefully neutral in tone, focusing on facts rather than political commentary. But the facts themselves were damning. They showed with clinical precision how the Nazi regime had sacrificed its own soldiers to logistical incompetence and ideological blindness. American intelligence officers collected these accounts eagerly. Some were used in psychological warfare operations, leaflets and radio broadcasts aimed at German troops. Others were filed away for future reference, potential evidence in whatever legal proceedings might follow the war's end. All of them contributed to a growing documentary record of German military failures. Bauer's journal entries became more analytical. March 15, 1944. I've been thinking about responsibility, not legal guilt, that's for courts to determine, but moral responsibility. I didn't commit atrocities. I was a medical officer trying to save lives within an impossible system. But I believed in the system. I supported it. I wore its uniform proudly. At what point does passive participation become active collaboration? When does following orders become moral culpability? I don't have answers. But I know this. Whatever Germany becomes after this war, it cannot be built on the same lies that led us to this disaster. We must face what we did, what we believed, why we failed. Not just militarily, but morally. The Americans didn't defeat us just with superior resources. They defeated us with superior values. Human dignity, respect for life, the belief that even enemies deserve humane treatment. These aren't weaknesses, they're strengths we failed to understand. By summer 1944, 1 year after Bauer's arrival at Camp Shelby, the transformation of German prisoners had become the subject of academic study. Psychologists from various universities visited the camps to interview prisoners, trying to understand the mechanism of ideological change. How did devoted Nazis become critics of the regime? What combination of factors produced such dramatic shifts in worldview? The answer, researchers found, was less complicated than theories predicted. It wasn't sophisticated propaganda or clever psychological manipulation. It was simply the sustained contrast between expectation and reality. Prisoners expected cruelty and received kindness. They expected deprivation and received abundance. They expected to be treated as subhuman and were treated with dignity. Eventually, cognitive dissonance demanded resolution. Either American behavior had to be reframed as somehow sinister, or German propaganda had to be recognized as false. Most prisoners, faced with daily evidence of American decency, chose the latter. Dr. Patterson co-authored a paper on the medical recovery of Afrika Korps prisoners that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in August 1944. The paper's conclusions were straightforward. Adequate nutrition and basic medical care could restore even severely malnourished patients to health within 3 to 4 months. The paper also included a pointed observation, quote 66. The paper made waves in military medical circles. It demonstrated that the German military, despite its reputation for efficiency and organization, had failed at the most basic task of any armed force, keeping its soldiers alive and healthy. This failure wasn't accidental or unavoidable. It was the inevitable result of a war economy that couldn't sustain the campaigns it had initiated. Bauer read the paper with professional interest and personal pain. His name appeared in the acknowledgments. Quote 67. It was strange seeing his name in an American medical journal. Stranger still, to be thanked for contributing to what was essentially an indictment of German military medicine. But the work gave him purpose. If he couldn't practice medicine as a prisoner, he could at least contribute to medical knowledge. He began working on a more detailed account of nutritional diseases in the Wehrmacht, drawing on his experiences and those of other captured medical officers. The account was clinical, focusing on epidemiology and treatment rather than assigning blame. But the implications were clear. Germany had waged war beyond its means and paid the price in countless preventable deaths. October 1944 marked 18 months since Bauer's capture. He now weighed 84 kilograms, 2 kilograms more than his pre-war weight. His leg had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar that ached slightly in cold weather. By every measurable standard, he was healthier now than he'd been when he enlisted in the Wehrmacht. The war news was increasingly grim for Germany. The Soviets had entered Poland. The Americans and British were pushing through France toward the German border. Italy was nearly lost. German cities were being systematically destroyed by around-the-clock bombing. The regime's collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. In Camp Shelby, prisoners began tentatively discussing the future. Some wanted to remain in America rather than return to whatever remained of Germany. Others felt obligated to go home, to help rebuild what had been destroyed. A few maintained that Germany would somehow rally, that wonder weapons would still appear, that the tide would turn. But these voices grew fainter each month. Bauer found himself thinking about his family in Munich. He hadn't received mail from them since his capture. Communications between prisoners and families in enemy territory were severed. He didn't know if his parents were alive, if their house had survived the bombing, if Munich still existed as anything more than rubble. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Quote 68. Miller advised. Quote 69. Quote 70. Quote 71. It was a philosophical question neither could answer. They were alive and safe while Germany burned. That created a survivor's guilt that no amount of rational thinking could entirely dispel. They'd been captured early, before the worst disasters. They'd been fed and healed while their countrymen starved and died. They'd learned that the war was unjust while their former comrades continued fighting for a lost cause. The psychological burden was immense. Some prisoners cracked under it. Depression became common in late 1944 as the magnitude of Germany's defeat became undeniable. American camp psychiatrists worked to address it, but there was no easy treatment for existential despair. Men who'd built their identities around Nazi ideology found themselves adrift when that ideology collapsed. They'd sacrificed years, friends, health, and innocence for a cause that had proven both evil and incompetent. How does one recover from that? Bauer coped by throwing himself into work. He expanded his role in the camp hospital, taking on more responsibility as his medical skills returned. He taught anatomy and physiology to American medics, sharing techniques from German medical training. He continued documenting the nutritional diseases he'd witnessed. He helped newly arrived prisoners navigate the psychological shock of captivity. The work was meaningful, but it couldn't entirely fill the void left by collapsed certainties. Bauer had been raised in a culture of absolutes, right and wrong, superior and inferior, victory or annihilation. American captivity had introduced him to ambiguity, to moral complexity, to the uncomfortable reality that good and evil often coexisted within the same people and systems. This was harder to process than physical recovery. The body could heal in months. The mind took longer. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought the coldest temperatures Mississippi had seen in years. Snow fell in January, rare for that latitude, and prisoners marveled at the white landscape. Many hadn't seen snow since leaving Europe. It reminded them of home, of winters before the war, of lives that now seemed impossibly distant. Christmas 1944 was more subdued than the previous year. The prisoners knew too much now, had lost too many illusions. They celebrated from habit rather than conviction, going through rituals that had lost their meaning. The special dinner, turkey and all the trimmings, seemed obscene given what they knew was happening in Germany. While they ate well in Mississippi, German civilians were starving. While they slept in warm barracks, German cities were being incinerated by firebombs. Quote 72. Someone said during the Christmas meal. Quote 73. Miller shook his head. Quote 74. Quote 75. No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and accusatory. Bauer remained silent during these debates. He'd moved beyond questions of loyalty and solidarity to something deeper and more troubling. He'd begun to question whether Germany deserved to survive. The regime was evil. That much was clear. But how much of the population had supported that evil? How many Germans had believed the propaganda, participated in the crimes, cheered the conquests? Was Germany itself guilty, or just its leaders? These were dangerous thoughts, corrosive thoughts. But Bauer couldn't escape them. He'd seen what German ideology produced, suffering for everyone, including Germans themselves. Perhaps the only path forward was through complete destruction and rebuilding from scratch. Perhaps Germany needed to die so something better could be born from its ashes. April 1945 brought news that shattered even the most optimistic delusions. The Soviets had entered Berlin. Hitler was dead. Suicide in his bunker as the Reich crumbled around him. Germany had unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In Camp Shelby, the news was received with stunned silence. It was one thing to know defeat was coming, another to face its reality. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. The German Empire that had dominated Europe was gone. What remained was unclear, a void waiting to be filled. Prisoners gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Some wept openly. Others sat in shock, staring at nothing. A few expressed relief that the killing had finally stopped. Most felt a complicated mixture of grief, shame, and fear about what came next. Bauer walked alone through the camp that evening, needing space to think. 2 years ago, he'd been a medical officer in Rommel's Afrika Korps, believing himself part of an invincible army representing the master race. Now he was a prisoner in Mississippi, having watched that army starve itself to defeat and that ideology collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The transformation wasn't just his personal experience. It was Germany's collective experience writ small. An entire nation had marched confidently into disaster, sustained by lies and propaganda, only to be awakened by the brutal reality of defeat. What lessons would Germany learn from this? Would it face its crimes honestly, or retreat into comfortable myths about betrayal and misfortune? Bauer didn't know, but he knew his own responsibility. He'd survived when millions hadn't. He'd been healed when millions had suffered. He'd learned truths that needed to be shared. When he eventually returned to Germany, whenever that might be, he would carry those truths with him, not as accusations, but as testimony, as evidence that another path was possible, that enemies could show mercy, that strength wasn't found in cruelty, but in humanity. The months after Germany's surrender brought new uncertainties. Prisoners learned gradually about the full extent of Nazi crimes, the concentration camps, the systematic murder of millions, the Holocaust. These revelations hit like successive blows, each more devastating than the last. Some prisoners refused to believe it. It's propaganda, they insisted, allied lies to justify their bombing of civilians. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, testimonies, documents, film footage. American authorities required prisoners to attend presentations documenting the concentration camps. Bauer watched footage from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau with mounting horror. The emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the clinical efficiency of industrial murder. He thought he'd seen the worst of what Germany had become when he'd watched his men die of starvation in North Africa. He'd been wrong. The nutritional catastrophe of the Afrika Korps was merely negligence, the inevitable result of logistical incompetence. The concentration camps were something far worse, deliberate, systematic evil on a scale that defied comprehension. After the presentation, Bauer sat alone in the hospital ward, struggling to breathe. His medical training provided clinical names for what he'd seen: cachexia, terminal malnutrition, typhus, dysentery. But no medical terminology could encompass the moral horror. These weren't casualties of war. They were victims of murder, industrial-scale murder carried out by Germans like himself. People who spoke his language, shared his culture, claimed to represent his nation's values. Miller found him there hours later. Quote 78. Bauer nodded, unable to speak. Quote 79. Miller said quietly, quote 80, quote 81. Bauer said finally. His voice sounded hollow in his own ears. Quote 80, quote 3, quote A4. Miller had no answer. It was the question haunting every German prisoner who'd seen the evidence. They'd thought themselves ordinary soldiers fighting for their country. Now they had to confront the possibility that they'd been part of something monstrous, that their service, however unwilling, had sustained a regime whose core purpose was genocide. In the months that followed, American authorities implemented a comprehensive denazification program for prisoners. Education sessions, discussions, exposure to democratic principles and practices. Some prisoners resisted, clinging to fragments of Nazi ideology or retreating into cynicism. But many, like Bauer, engaged seriously with the material. They'd already been prepared by 2 years of cognitive dissonance. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and American reality had softened the ground. The revelation of the Holocaust completed the transformation. Bauer participated in a discussion group led by an American political science professor who'd been brought in to facilitate denazification. The group met twice weekly to discuss German history, democratic theory, human rights, and the nature of totalitarianism. Why did we believe? Someone asked during one session. How could an entire nation follow Hitler into that abyss? The professor didn't offer easy answers. Quote 87. Quote 88. Bauer said. Quote 89. Quote 90. The answer was obvious. German education, especially under the Nazis, had emphasized obedience and conformity. Critical thinking was discouraged. Independent judgment was suspect. The entire system was designed to produce followers, not questioners. Quote 91. The professor continued, quote 92. It sounded impossible. Germany was rubble, its cities destroyed, its economy shattered, its political institutions discredited. Rebuilding physical infrastructure would take years. Rebuilding moral and intellectual infrastructure might take generations. But Bauer found himself cautiously hopeful. If he could transform from believing Nazi to critical thinker, then perhaps Germany could transform as well. It wouldn't be easy. It would require confronting painful truths and accepting responsibility for terrible crimes. But the alternative was to learn nothing, to repeat the same mistakes, to ensure that millions had died for nothing. The repatriation process began in late 1945. Prisoners would be sent home gradually, starting with those who posed no security risk and had useful skills for reconstruction. Bauer, as a physician with no record of war crimes or Nazi party membership beyond the compulsory requirements, was on the early lists. He received the news with mixed emotions. Part of him desperately wanted to go home, to find his family, to contribute to rebuilding. Another part felt safer in Mississippi, in the known environment of the camp, away from the chaos and devastation of post-war Germany. What will you do? Patterson asked during their final meeting. When you get back? Practice medicine if I can. Help rebuild the healthcare system. It will be needed. Millions of wounded, sick, traumatized people. Bauer paused. And I'll tell the truth about what I experienced here. Not as propaganda for America, but as evidence that another way is possible. That enemies can show mercy. That human dignity matters regardless of nationality or ideology. Patterson nodded. The war's over, but the real work is just beginning. Germany needs to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul. That will take people like you, people who've seen both sides and understand what went wrong. They shook hands, former enemies who'd become something like colleagues, even friends. It was an improbable ending to a relationship that began with one man barely alive and the other charged with keeping him that way. December 1945. Bauer stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the American coastline recede into the distance. He was heading back to Europe, to whatever remained of Germany, carrying with him 2 years of experiences that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. The ship was crowded with repatriated prisoners, all facing the same uncertainty. What would they find at home? What role would they have in rebuilding? How would they be received, as returning soldiers or as defeated enemies? Bauer thought about the journey that had brought him here, from confident Wehrmacht officer to starving skeleton to healthy man, from true believer to questioner to something approaching wisdom. The physical transformation had taken 3 months. The psychological transformation was still ongoing. He thought about the German prisoners still arriving at American camps in the final months of the war, men who would go through the same shock of cognitive dissonance he'd experienced. The realization that everything they'd been taught about enemies was false, that American, quote, 98 was actually strength, that the much vaunted German superiority was hollow propaganda. He thought about Dr. Patterson and the nurses who'd saved his life, about Major Harrison documenting the nutritional catastrophe with clinical precision, about the guards who'd treated prisoners with brusque courtesy rather than cruelty, about the system that had chosen to heal rather than harm, even when dealing with enemies. Most of all, he thought about the responsibility he now carried. He'd been given a second chance, rescued from the edge of death, healed in body and mind, educated in truths that needed sharing. That gift came with obligation. Not to praise America uncritically or to condemn Germany absolutely, but to bear witness to what he'd seen, to testify that transformation was possible, that individuals and nations could change when confronted with reality. The ship pushed through winter waters toward a devastated continent. Bauer didn't know what he would find there, probably ruins, possibly his family, if they'd survived. Certainly a society in crisis, struggling to understand how it had embraced such evil and what it could become now that the evil had been defeated. But he knew what he would bring to that crisis, the memory of being treated with humanity when he expected cruelty, the experience of being healed by enemies who had every reason to let him die, the understanding that dignity and respect weren't weaknesses but foundations for rebuilding. It wasn't much. One man's story couldn't undo the Holocaust or resurrect the dead or erase the crimes of the regime he'd served. But it was something. A single data point in the collective reckoning Germany would have to undergo. Evidence that even in the midst of total war, humanity could persist. The American coast disappeared below the horizon. Ahead lay only gray water and uncertain future. Bauer gripped the ship's railing and thought about Friedrich Bauer of July 1943, the man who'd been carried from a freight car because his legs wouldn't support him. That man was dead, killed by the same war that had nearly killed his body. In his place stood someone different, someone who died and been resurrected, not through his own strength, but through the unexpected mercy of strangers. He'd gone into American captivity weighing 132 pounds, believing himself part of the master race, convinced his enemies were subhuman barbarians. He was leaving weighing 185 pounds, knowing himself to be simply human, understanding his enemies had been more humane than he'd deserved. The transformation of Friedrich Bauer was complete. The transformation of Germany was just beginning. And somewhere in the space between those two transformations lay the possibility of redemption, not through forgetting or excusing, but through honest reckoning with truth.